Good evening, everybody. It's been a long time since we've done one of these, it feels like. I think probably the longest break that we have had since we've been doing KC Happy Hour. So only right to rush home from Vegas. We actually just pulled back in here to Dallas about an hour ago. Trevor and Kyle, a couple other guys on the team, they're actually taking the RV and the trailer back to where we park it, unloading the rest of the stuff. So we're still not even all the way out of Vegas. A few of the race teams I saw on social media were getting out today. So I'm sure that's the same for a lot of people at the end of the traveling circus. But this year, thanks to the F1 boys, we're done a week earlier, so that's cool. And for those that are watching the broadcast, maybe watch one of these happy hours for the first time, thanks for watching. My name's Xander. I'm going to bring in a couple of our guys. We'll have Jordon Musser join us later tonight. Normally, I would go straight to one of the winners from this weekend. Ryan Norberg's a little busy. He'll join us next week. And the same for Danny Formal. He will join us next week, hopefully, after winning the Lamborghini Super Trofeo World Final. So he was straight over there after the Super Sunday main last weekend. But a little bittersweet news. So this is Happy Hour 99. I'd been thinking about what to do with this show for a little while now. Again, I've been kind of missing some episodes. This will be the second to last show that we will do as KC Happy Hour. Next week, I'm going to end it on episode number 100. We're going to bring back a lot of the original cast. Paulie Massimino, Connor Zilish, Norberg will come back. Try and work on Jar Scrack is a little tougher. Either next week or the next episode. It may end up being one more week out. But as we're getting bigger and bigger, it's kind of molded and changed over the 100 episodes and 98 to this point. And so to explain a little bit of that, when we started KC Happy Hours, actually before we ever did any live streams at all, we were just doing short form videos on YouTube that were maybe 10 to 15 minutes long. And we felt like we weren't interviewing the drivers for long enough to let you guys get to know who's who and learn the drivers' personalities enough to want to root for them or root against them. And so the idea behind the show is we'd bring drivers on and we'd interview them in a longer conversation. So instead of being short sound bites, you'd get a bit more of a real view of, who that person was, what they thought, and then they have a lot of, introspective. Well, then as we started the broadcasts, we got to interview these guys a lot longer. We got to do a lot more stuff with them. And the whole company just exploded from myself and Trevor making YouTube videos to full-time employees, a staff of over 40 different contractors on any given year, and 30 plus weekends on the road. And then from there, this became kind of our industry talk show. We'd come on here after a race, before a race, and, try to push for what we wanted to happen. And we'll get into some of the really cool stuff coming for next year that we had a helping hand in kind of influencing and getting into the boardroom for. At this time last year, into the winter, when we kind of ran out of racing to talk about, I was able to kind of play silly season with the race series schedules. Well, on that second kind of part of this mission from episode 50 or so on, job accomplished there too. We have had a lot of really great conversations with all the series promoters and a lot more influence and involvement and invitations to the table to try and ask for things than, I think any streaming company would ever, could ever ask for. To be able to do those driver intros at Super Sunday or, to get the pro show formats that we'll talk about in a little bit announced at Stars and at SKUSA. I mean, that kind of stuff is really cool. And in that same conversation, now we're kind of on the inside. So I don't want to lie to you guys and play that silly season game and try to throw you, off the beaten path or off of the right track of guessing the right tracks where we're going to go. But to be honest, I kind of know a little bit too much now. So what we're going to do is, again, this week, will be episode 99. We're going to have one more KC Happy Hour, episode number 100. We'll bring back, like I said, a lot of the original cast for it, kind of have a little bit of fun, reminisce on a lot of the fun stuff we've had with the show, mistakes, hiccups, good moments, funny moments, and kind of set us up for 24. And we're going to kind of split a few things up. So, one podcast that not many people know about, we have a few episodes on, is the Xander Clements podcast. And that one's more of just a one-to-one personality thing. Well, we're going to do more of that in 2024. I'm going to have more of some of my guys that'll be joining us here in a second. They'll get their own shows for 24 and do more social content. So the extra content outside of a broadcast weekend won't be going away. But in the way that this show has kind of evolved and moved around and everything, and especially with the time constraints to continue to move this business forward and try to keep growing our sport. It's gonna come to the end of its chapter, which I think coming to episode 100, I always label these episodes on YouTube with a 0 in front of the double digit. This one's 0.99. So I guess I was always anticipating we get to triple digits. I wasn't sure how far, but I think going right to it and hitting the end of the chapter there after 2.5 years is a pretty good run. So I wanted to lead off the show with that, but there's so much good to talk about after last weekend. There's a lot of you guys continuing to sign on. I want to get into it. I want to bring some of our guys into it. We got the SKUSA Shifter Master, SuperNats 26 Vice Champion, Jordon Musser. That'll join us a little bit later. He'll give us a bit more of a driver's eye. And again, we'll probably armchair quarterback this race for weeks to come, including with a lot of that original cast coming back either next week or the week after. So without further ado, Kaleb Viesca joining me here in the studio. Emory Lyda joining me here in the studio. Jordon Musser's in the green room. He'll join us in a little bit. But to wrap the week, fellas, for Emory, remind me, was this your first SuperNats as well? So both of you guys' first experience of it, right?
Yeah, first experience.
Well, thoughts?
I mean, honestly, like it lived up to every expectation I had and then some. Like as a young kid, this was something that I always looked up to. And unfortunately, as a driver, we never really had the budget to necessarily go out to Vegas and do it. So to be kind of on the other side, like I mean, I've watched live timing of it for as long as I can remember. I've watched the broadcast last year. I've been following it for so long, but to finally be in Vegas, to have that full week experience and kind of see all of the hype, all of the intensity. I mean, there's really not enough I could say to describe it other than it kind of fulfilled a dream of mine. And I have to say, like, it was everything I was looking for. The racing was amazing. And I mean, in North America, there's really no bigger kart event here. Really in the world, in terms of the spectacle, you could argue it's the biggest show in karting on the world. And the racing lives up to that as well. So it was a ton of fun. I think the racing produced great highlights, great sort of intense battles. And I mean, as a kid growing up getting into karting, I was like, this is the end goal, is enough at SKUSA or at SuperNats. And even though it wasn't necessarily the form I was anticipating in the first place, it's really nice to be there.
And Kaleb, a lot of guys recognize you from our streams, but unlike myself and Emory, you're a new age karting guy over the last couple of years. So what was your takeaways from the whole deal? Because I mean, I think you're the closest thing that we've had on this show to like almost like a new to the person sport being at this level.
Yeah, of course. So I'd say I got into karting in like 2021, and I'd always hear about the SuperNats and stuff like that. And I was able to work with you guys a little bit last year in 2022, and then I watched the live stream, and it looked like such a spectacle. And it literally, when I was there this year, it lived up to the hype. I remember hearing Rob do the like welcome to Super Sunday, and I was sitting there on the camera and literally just chills like on my arms, and it was crazy. And then the final, the shifter final as well. It's I remember Danny watching one of these episodes. He said that KZ is literally the pinnacle of karting. And this weekend, having all those European drivers and all the national drivers there as well, it literally lived up to the hype. So that's what I can say about my experience at SuperNats this past weekend.
Well, I'm optimistic. Hopefully, we can get him back. I was talking with Billy Musgrave a little bit about it. We were, I think we ended at 73 on pro shifter entries on the weekend. That was only about a couple down after scratches and walks last year. But I'd put the top half of this field above last year's shifter field for a couple of reasons. I think both we had obviously the European champ with Albanese, the world champ with Ippolito. It felt like, and I don't know the number for sure, and Emory as our on-screen statistician can probably back me up here compared to 2022's field. But I feel like the American guys got a lot better. And that was one thing that was a big takeaway for me. I caught up with Kyle Wick after his big win at Rock Vegas Sunday night. He's like, Marin Kremers rolls into the U.S. in 2021, and he puts 8 seconds on us back-to-back days in New Orleans. And, yeah, we were not as good as we thought we were that weekend. But fast forward a year and a half, fast forward almost 2 years, and, he's like, I can go head-to-head with that guy. He's like, our chassis tuning can go head-to-head with that guy. Our engine tuning, which is the last piece in KZ that's so critical that Jordon's going to be able to give us a lot of input on when we bring him on, was cool. So hopefully as well, the added viewership. We were just a skosh under the FIA Worlds, which was mega to be able to do that. For those watching, I'm working on getting a analytics post together like we did last year. We were somewhere in the ballpark of 3 million impressions over the week. The viewership, the peak viewership was, I think, 4,000 during the Pro X30 race, 3,800 during the shifters. I think the third highest viewed race was KA Senior, but I think KA Junior was really close to it too. And they weren't far off. I think that only one or two races even dropped below the 3,000 view mark on Sunday, but the whole week, year to year was double. And comparing Sunday to the 2021 stream that SKUSA had done with a different partner was double. So we doubled in 22, and then we doubled our own 2022 numbers for the most part in 2023, because we peaked on screen. So there's the three metrics. There's your any minute audience, that's the number of people watching that second. There is the total views on the day, and then there's total unique viewers. So you click on the stream 3 times, it's going to count 3 views on the day. You'll count as 1 unique viewer on the day. And then again, the any minute audience, that's the peak of the guys watching at that time. And that's kind of where we can kind of gauge what classes to push and how to kind of continue to lean into the strengths of the sport, which typically ends up being, like Danny said, the pro shifter stuff, the X30 stuff, the KA stuff, and senior normally comes close. Junior's been getting really close. Mini and micro is good. And unfortunately, the class that ends up normally a little bit lower down is the masters. But I don't think it's because they're any bit worse than any of the kids' classes. I think the masters problem is just that, at their age, grandma and grandpa don't watch them nearly as much as when they're 7, 8 years old. So we have all that coming out. That was really, really cool. But we talk about next year, right? And in all the stuff that went down since the last time we were on Happy Hour, I wanted to go over a little bit of this with everybody before we got to our break and bring Jordon in. So let's talk about the pro shows and what do these mean. So there were a lot of questions to kind of how these came together. And for those of you guys that have just only recently been watching us, if you haven't seen a Happy Hour from SKUSA SuperNats in Newcastle, which would be putting us right around July 25th or 26th of this year. There's about a 2.5-hour episode. If you want to listen to it, should be available on Spotify for an audio podcast as well, like all of our weekly episodes are. But myself, Chase Jones, Braden Eves, and Race Liberante all kind of hashed out somewhat of an idea and why it would work to run an alternate format to what we normally do. The conversation had been, years, at least a year, if not months in the making to go to where we're going to go. These announcements came out a couple of weeks ago, back in October. And so let's break down kind of where this benefits, right? Stars comes out with their announcement first thing in the morning. SKUSA does one as well, comes out the same day. Both of these had been months in the works. Again, SuperNats has only worked on it and really kind of ironed things out. And when I pitched it to SKUSA, and they were pretty much on board, and then it took a little while to get together. The Stars guys as well, same thing. They had their pro show format ready to go in Cincinnati, tweaked on it, listened to the teams. And with SKUSA, they had me go around on Thursday night to every race team in the pits and try to explain what we were going to do. So here's the main things of what this is going to accomplish. Again, we'll have a breakdown so you guys can see the analytics as well, because I think that's really important for all the viewers to see, where your numbers are at, so that way you can see them and you can also go to your sponsors and say, hey, here's how many people are watching me. Here's what the total reach on the stream is. I think that's really key. And I think that's something that, again, we got into doing what we're doing with Kart Chaser for, you guys, the drivers and the community of the sport, to try and make more opportunities for you guys. So that's one thing. But you'll see on those that there's about a 20 to 25% uptick when the pro classes are on the racetrack. And that's with the formats that we run currently, where their pre-final and everyone's pre-final is a 4-hour gap from the main. And they're just kind of spliced throughout the day. And even with that, they still end up quickly spiking. And then as soon as they go off the racetrack and go to the next class, it kind of drops back down to an overall healthy number. That being said, it's not like it drops down for everybody. Year to year, as we overall grow views, the views overall grow. It's not like the gap from the 25% kind of comes down, but those classes kind of are the rising tide that rises, lifts all boats. So I was thinking for a while if there was a way that we could take the two classes that pull the most eyeballs and move them into a tight built for TV style time slot, it would be better it might end up helping us maximize the views on the weekend, which again always trickles down to the rest of the classes. Along with that, there was a lot of questions of how do we make it attractive as it stands right now for teams to want to run drivers in these classes. Well, for a lot of these guys, some of the guys we mentioned, right, the European factory guys that come over, the American guys like in this picture, AJ Myers and Marian Kremers, in there with David Trefalog and Tim Troger. I mean, these are factory paid professional go-kart drivers. Part of the value of a team bringing them over to the States is using them as a driver coach, whether it's for that class or for the other classes in the day. So if they're able to work with all of the other support classes, the KA classes, the mini, the micro, the junior, the master, as a full-time data and coach guy, they can bring a lot more value to the team. Whereas in the blended format that we normally run on these regular race weekends up until this point, they can't. They can sort of help, they can sort of coach, but you still need a separate guy for that. So you're spending money to run this guy here, pay for his entry, pay for his tires, pay a daily rate if he charges one. Some drivers get paid, some just race for free. And you also have to hire a specific mechanic for him. If they run at the end of the day, then all of the mechanics can kind of double dip. And that's a very similar way of working that we've seen at split day races so far, like the SuperNats, where everybody is split up through the week. So you see a lot of mechanics work on two go-karts, one in the morning group during the week, one in the afternoon. And then Sunday's a blend, but with just a practice session and a final, and there's so much time in between, it's very easy. All you're really doing is putting on new tires if you want to run new tires and warm up, and then new tires for the final. And you're not making a lot of massive swings. Practice days are the days where you're really busy and through the heats. But in this case, these guys are going to run at the end of the day all 3 days, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And for SKUSA, where there's optional Thursday practice, they will also run at the end of the day. The last thing was with these classes, again, these guys are running shifter and X30 more so for exposure, maybe purse money or to make a living if they're a professional driver. But exposure and competition. They're not running where they're dividing their dollars against their laps. So you can cut track time and you can increase TV time with interviews and whatnot. And no one's really going to complain. Whereas if you were to cut a practice session by 5 minutes or cut a practice session completely in a mini or a micro or a junior class, you better be ready with a riot coming your way. So I thought we could get really creative with these guys' format to make it a little more built for TV. So there's going to be 2-stage qualifying at the Pro Tour. That'll be really interesting. They're going to split the fields in half. Top 6 will transfer into a Super Pole, and the top 12 will then set the first 12 starting spots in a secondary qualifying session with 1 or 2 laps. They'll still run a pre-final Saturday, and then Sunday we're going to axe their warm-up session and do more pre-race coverage, driver intros, not to the same SuperNats degree, but a lot of grid walks and interviews, and the same with post-race interviews, because I felt like with the way that the blended schedule works, not only is it tough for everyone to kind of tune in and tune out for the classes you want, we only really have time to interview the winner and maybe the top 3. In this new format, we'll get to interview probably the entire top 10 and some of the back markers too. So if you run these classes, you'll actually get more exposure than the rest of them, which is kind of something that, again, elevates them to the point that these should be the pinnacle of our sport. But they're going to save the team's money by getting more value out of the drivers and being able to split mechanics up throughout the day, which hopefully will help. And then what was really cool was while I was over at SKUSA, I told them as well that, SKUSA and USPKS have been very heavy on trying to support the pro classes for a long time, and even other classes as well. I mean, you could see with SKUSA in the semi-pro classes, they've been paying money as long as you hit over 30 entries. And the pro classes normally is a 20 or a 30 driver minimum. Shifter, they dropped it to 20 because it's more expensive and harder to pull the numbers. But X30 still had to pull 30. So, for example, last year, Mini, KA Junior, and KA Senior all got paid in the top 3 drivers. And they also run with a slightly lower entry fee. So that's why their pay is a little bit less. But again, for a pro class, these guys will happily, if they're going to go be a professional, pay $100 more in entry fee, which their entry fee is going to go up a little bit. I think it's going to only be 75 or 100. I'm pretty sure where we ended was about 100. But in this kind of pseudo arms race, which kind of has a mean connotation between USPKS and SKUSA to try and pad the race day prizes, they've forgotten that they've kind of minimalized their championship prize in comparison. So the one point that I made with the SKUSA guys, which Stars hasn't released their prize structure. I know they're working on something big. I know USPK is also working on really beefing up their prize structures. They've also been a very big proponent of trying to pay the classes at the very end of the karting structure, and work their way down as well to give support to everyone else. But with these guys, I was like, we are paying, $2,500 or $5,000 to win a single weekend, and you're giving, as you can see, the cash prizes didn't exist last year. All that existed in 2023 was a Pro Tour entry and tires. It's a $5,000 evaluation for the champ, but it's $0 in cash. Whereas that guy could win Pro Tour on Saturday and win Pro Tour on Sunday, and he'd walk away with $5,000 in cash. So of course, guys are going to pick and choose races throughout the year, not run the full season. And making that point there, they were like, okay, all right, how much do we need? So we started with a $26,000 cash base that'll pay the whole top 10 instead of just the top champ or the top 3. And everyone in the top 10 is going to get free entry and tires for the following season's Pro Tour. So in a way, it's going to work a lot like the IndyCar winner's circle, which if you finish in the top 22 in points in an IndyCar season, your team owner gets roughly $1 million, which is a big help towards what's typically about a $5 to $6 million ask to run a full IndyCar season. So that was a long-winded everybody a little bit of insight as to kind of why those things will be where they're at. The other benefit, going back to the Pro Show format in general, is that by moving these classes to the end of the day and having built-in interview time with them, now KA Senior is going to be the headline class of the morning and early afternoon show. And all of the other classes as well will be fully focused from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m. on a SKUSA weekend and on a Stars weekend with the Pro Show format. We will have no headline classes kind of putting their elbows out and blocking out any other division with interviews to get. So we'll be able to interview more minis, more micros, more juniors, more KA masters, more shifter masters, more KA seniors. And again, it's going to give, it's going to kind of, by splitting the spotlight up, just like how it was at SuperNats this week, you have more time to focus in and promote those guys as their own individual divisions. We have a lot of other stuff to kind of have some ideas on how to promote those support classes, but having a helping hand in putting these pro shows together, and a huge thanks to SKUSA. SKUSA actually flew me personally out to their headquarters to help make sure that they did it right based on the idea that I was telling them. A big thanks to all the teams that have given a ton of input on both of these formats. And again, for both series for listening. Stars, they're a more internally focused program, but again, they've been working on the same exact mission that we've been on. And so it was a lot of collaboration together and talks together. And hell, I was just talking with, I meant to get on a call with Jackson Gardner, who's their main marketing guy, earlier today, and just played phone tag and missed him. So all of this kind of stuff, being able to explain it on a show like this is great. But while we're working on it, I don't want to blow the cover, and I also don't want to blow up any deals that we have with these series. We're making such good progress. And it's part of the reason why this is, going to be a bit of a swan song of us for happy hour. So in any case, I wanted to make sure that I got to, at least for myself personally, be able to explain to everybody kind of what we got going on for next year. We'll still be at a lot of other races. I don't have our schedule yet. Optimistically, I might have a good idea of what it's going to look like by happy hour episode 100. Maybe we'll do an announcement later this year when the contracts and all the deals and agreements get done. We'll have a lot of races. It's going to look a lot like this year. But this is super positive. I think doing these pro show formats is going to help us continue to build off the SuperNats and all the other streams that we've done that have seen big growth and bring more eyes to the sport. It's going to help spread the load, I think, where teams are going to be able to be, get more value out of sponsoring a driver in the headline classes, and which will hopefully lead to more sponsor drive opportunities for drivers in those headline classes, regardless of whether you're going to cars or not. And it's just going to mean that, if we get more guys that are getting, paid either directly or indirectly to race go-karts because of how good and how fast they are, we're going to get better races to watch as fans. And that's the coolest part of the whole thing. So, long-winded, Kaleb and Emory. I took the mic for a while, but your guys' thoughts on that whole deal. Kaleb, you first.
I remember whenever you told us about the idea, and I think from the start, same thing you said, right? One of the biggest feedbacks that we get, I guess, from parents when we're pit reporting on weekends is that sometimes they get a little bit upset that we can't interview some of the minis, some of the micros, or even some of the juniors, because those are all really interesting races and classes. So I think with the pro show, it's going to be more publicity for their kids. And then for some of the KA guys as well, sometimes we can't get to them on a weekend, and then that's really going to help us continue to do that. And I think the whole spectacle of it as well, right, for the pro show and for the pro classes and in SKUSA and stars, it's going to be, I would say it's going to be kind of like SuperNats, wherever you have like the level of spectacle. Now it's going to be almost every weekend, and I think that adds a lot to the pro side of karting, and those drivers are going to feel more like pro drivers now, because there's pro level cash prizes, and it's gonna be a spectacle, like you said.
Yeah. And I also think like one of the biggest things too is when you look at the classes as a whole, I mean, I think SuperNats in some ways is a good preview for a little bit of what we can do with the with the like morning coverage, for example. And like I mentioned, or like Kaleb mentioned, like a lot of parents have mentioned how we don't necessarily get to interview a lot of the non-pro classes. I mean, it is a shame, because at the end of the day, there are hundreds of stories that happen every race weekend that you just simply don't have time to cover. And as someone that has been in KA myself for 6 years, like I've had a lot of experience, or I feel kind of the same way at times. But I think that by moving the pro show to the afternoon, it kind of does a couple of different things. Like it allows you to get that exposure really for the stories that happen outside of our main focus during the day. Like if you see, like two examples I always think of are Ernesto Rivera's run in Orlando this year, where he chased down Max Saylor from like a 2 to 3 second deficit. And it was immediately after that, you had both pro classes, so you didn't get an interview after it. And it was like, I felt really bad in the moment as someone that was doing the interviews that weekend, because I was like, that's one of the craziest races I've ever seen. And because we had to fit it into a schedule where we had both of the pro classes after, it just didn't work out. And again, like Lucas Palacio down in Miami went from 29th to 1st. And it was, I think that one we got a brief interview in. But like those stories that before wouldn't get massive publicity on a race weekend, they kind of get shuffled to the wayside just a little bit. Now we have more time to focus on them. So I think that in doing that too, and again, in SuperNats, you realize like we had more interviews for the KA guys than for X30 and Shifter, simply because they really didn't have, they had a nice window where it was like we were more able to focus more on the pre and the post race for them. And like that opens more exposure, like guys like Colin Lloyd, for example, or even a Peyton Phillips that, you know, normally wouldn't get that kind of exposure in the KA category. Now, with them being the headline of the semi-pro division, you get more exposure opportunities for them, and hopefully that opens some eyes. And instead of them kind of just being sort of a footnote to the other guys during the day, they're not getting to be in the pro show per se, but they get more exposure and more coverage opportunities than they already would. And that kind of covers the other classes. But for the pro side of things, that's where you get into, I think, the real exciting part of this, which is you're suddenly taking an event that for the longest time had kind of been, I guess, a cookie cutter race format would be the way I would describe it. I mean, for as long as I can remember, you've either had the 2 final day where it's like qualifying, pre-final, final, reset for Sunday, qualifying, pre-final, final, or you've had some variation of qualifying, 3 heats, final on Sunday. And both of those, I mean, they're great. Like they have produced great races over the years. But when you think about it, you go into pre-final at say 12:30 in the afternoon, you race that for 9-10 laps, and then boom, you're off the track again until 4:30. You have 4 hours of track evolution. You have all of this going on. The viewers kind of lose track of, hey, like what position did Austin Garrison finish in that pre-final? What happened? Like, sure, maybe if you're at the track, you're paying attention, you can keep track of all those things, but naturally you're going to get caught up in the fray. But when you separate these pro classes, you allow for more media exposure, same thing as the smaller classes. You can really hammer home the pre and the post race. And I think for anyone saying like, oh, like it's karting, like we don't need this, I think the more branding you give these drivers, the better it's going to look in the future. The more you're going to be able to continue bringing in these really good racing drivers. And Xander, you had a good point earlier about like, we should be hoping for these high-end European guys, for guys in the US to get paid to race karts, because that increases the level of competition. and it increases kind of the race quality that we end up getting. And so I think the media coverage is one thing. Obviously, as someone that does the interviews a lot of the time, I think it's always nice to get to talk to the drivers more and get to see more of their personal side of things. But I think that adding in that media coverage as well gives potential sponsors, it gives potential viewers at home a reason to root for them, a reason to continue supporting their racing efforts. And that has a lot of value. And then on the track as well, kind of separating the main show, you get to kind of run more back to back to back. It's more like it's easier to directly follow the storylines at home. It's easier to follow it at the track. Like, I think this is a format that on paper satisfies pretty much every need you want, whether it be the small class drivers, the pro class drivers, the teams. I think have an easier layout and format. I think the only downside would be if you were looking at it from the sense of, oh, how much time we have to spend at the track of the team, but that's such a small percentage of the paddock that seems to be worried about that. I think in terms of team benefit, driver benefit, parent mechanic benefit, and then exposure benefit, all of them are things that this format brings to the table. And I really think kudos to SKUSA and kudos to Stars for being willing to work and kind of break the cookie cutter mold, because I feel like that's going to be what grows karting more. It's not going to be continuing to make small evolutions on what we had. I think you need to find those format changes, those sort of opportunities to bring more exposure to the table. And it's hard to say when we haven't seen it in actions, but from all indications, from what I've heard, from what I've seen and thought out on paper, I think this is a really good move.
Yeah. And I mean, mathematically, it's going to work out roughly the same in terms of the amount of time at the racetrack, at least with what you have, because typically every class is about an hour in the day. So it's just moving that hour to the end of the day. It might end up being, 20, 30 minutes longer as everybody figures out how to work it, how to do it properly. The hot pit on Friday practice will be a big shift. I think it's going to be a spectacle to watch the pro classes, the next 30 and shifter, have a 30-minute car style session. Their main events will be about 5 to 10 minutes longer, which again was, to Braden's credit. And again, he mentions it on the podcast. He's like, coming out of 3 years in the road to Indy, I feel like when the checkered flag flies in a karting race in a main event, I'm ready to push that last 10%, and I'm missing the mark. And you look on the flip side, the kids that are going up into F4, into USF Juniors, into USF 2000 now are coming out of this 10-lap heat race mentality and maybe 20-lap main event mentality, where it is don't give an inch on the start, don't give an inch on the first lap, take every inch you get, and are causing a lot of wrecks and are bringing these races to be yellow filled. If we turn the headline of our sport where it's so attractive enough that hopefully kids want to do 1 year of it, or do 1 year of it alongside their first year in car racing, and they learn a 30-minute practice session that has a strategy meeting before and after, and a longer main event where they have to take care of their tires, and they're not worried about letting a guy go on lap 5, because if they go 100% on lap 5, they're going to be at 0% on lap 30. So that part's exciting. The other part's cool. And overall, again, this has been a big project working with all the series. So I wanted to get to talk to all you guys about it. We've obviously been super busy. Emory and Kaleb have done a great job. Our whole crew did an awesome job this weekend. And I think that's what we should talk about next. So we'll come back to any of this as well. I know there's a lot of you guys watching. A couple of you guys have sent in questions. I always love to do Q&As. And since I only got this show and one more left, if you guys want to send in your comments, send in your DMs, however you'd like to send us a question, go ahead and send it on in. Because when we come back from this commercial break, we're going to talk SuperNats 26, specifically on the event. And we're going to bring in one of the baddest shifter master, former pro shifter drivers in the world. And we're going to call him in the world because he's one of the best we got in the U.S., if not the best in the U.S. Jordon Musser will join us when we come back. So stick with us, guys. But if you got any questions about anything we just said about SuperNats 26 or anything for 2024, hit us up in the comment section. We'll answer it at the end of the show.
KC Happy Hour is proudly presented by the Rock Sonoma Karting Championship, presented by Cameron Race Promotions, the most competitive Northern California karting series, featuring a 2-day format with practice on Saturday and racing on Sunday, multiple track configurations, and a massive prize structure including tickets to Rock Vegas, race car test opportunities, and race rewards. Rock Sonoma is the training ground of multiple national karting champions each year and race car champions as well, featuring a full Rock Cup USA class structure with each race weekend streamed live via YouTube. It's a series you cannot miss. For more info, check us out online at zanzarukarting.com.
Welcome back to KC Happy Hour, episode 99. Myself, Xander, Clements, Kaleb, Viesca, Emory, Lyda, and joining us in the studio now is Mr. Jordon Musser. Jordon, thank you for coming on to the show here. I know you're traveling just like we are coming out of the event. So first of all, where are you right now? And thanks for coming.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm not too far from home. I'm in Austin, Texas. I live in Dallas, Texas, but I work out of Austin, so I travel quite a bit. Usually I'm at a race. Say Thursday through Sunday, I go to work, I get home on Sunday night, hang out with dogs and my girlfriend, Sunday night. And then I got to head Monday down to Austin to work Monday through Thursday or Monday through Wednesday if it's off to another race. So pretty busy between racing and trying to make enough money to keep racing.
Right. That's the big thing, man. Well, first of all, congrats on the big run this weekend. I want to have you as a guy that was obviously on track and can help us kind of break down the overall event, the track layout, which was totally different than probably every other SuperNats to this point. But first of all, for anyone that didn't follow you too closely, can you give us a bit of a kind of recap on how your weekend went?
Yeah. So overall, obviously positive. It's hard to complain, starting with the end, finishing second, field of roughly 47 guys and gals. Best in the United States for sure. Some of the best in the world, and actually not arguably the best in the world with Mr. Foray there, current world champion. So, it was a tough week for me to finish second when I led, I think it was 17 of 20. I've led something like 60 plus laps at the SuperNats and somehow have not won it. Finished second a bunch of times, been on pole, etc. But it was interesting, with the start of the weekend with the track change. I know you want to go into the track stuff a little bit later, but adapting to that, adapting to the fact the track was, part of it was almost a road course, with the top speed, the straightaway not being straight with multiple corners at 90 plus miles an hour. And then into a final kind of turn two, let's say, where you're braking from nearly 100 down to first gear. So definitely a different experience. Overall, pretty happy with how it worked out for my kart. Burrell put a lot of work into making changes to their shifter program for the U.S. market, and I think we're showing that with my second place finish and of course Kremers in the pro category.
Yeah, I mean, for you and for Marian, right? I mean, it's years and years of being damn so close. But as much as that burns, still super fast, still right there, still stride for stride. So yeah, let's go to the track first. So I got the visual aid here. This was before the adjustment. Obviously, SKUSA was handed kind of a rougher deck of cards in this lot. I remember Tom and Stan showing me the track layout here when I went out to Temecula to talk to them about the pro show format. And I was like, oof. And they're like, yeah, that's, we were like, it took them a few days to try and do the best that they could. As much as there's space to maybe go left or right or do things a little better, they're still a limited number of barriers. There's so many different bumpy spots on the circuit. There's the light poles that this map doesn't show. I know a lot of people were still critical of it, and I don't blame them. I think this obviously is a pretty simple layout, but even hearing from Tom and from Neil and from Stan and all the SKUSA staff, they're like Wednesday, Thursday, and even Tuesday, man, we screwed up. And then by the time we got to Sunday, at least raceability wise, it looked like it was still good because the track was wide enough you could pass. Maybe it wasn't the most technical thing in a single speed car. I mean, but I think when we say technical, right, we're used to a lot of corners. The single speed guys were trying to, as many teeth as they could rip off as possible. So if your car rolled better through the chicane and you drove it better, you ran less teeth, it was still technical. And for you guys in gearbox, instead of ripping, I mean, to a degree, changing the gear ratio, but like for Formal, he was trying all weekend to get into second gear for the chicane, or if you can just have a stable enough car to rip first gear out of so many times you're hitting first. Is that an accurate statement that for such a simple layout, it still ended up being somewhat tricky?
Yeah, and I think you touched on one thing, especially on the direct drive side. Sure, the track was simple, but when you pull that many teeth off the rear gear, the smallest mistake on the infield just punishes you. And that's why I think you saw such great racing in the single speed category is you have a combination of the track being simple. So you have, let's say, more people that can run a lap within a half tenth of the fastest guy. You've got a draft, which helps keep the pack together. But then you add in the fact that everybody's running a really small rear sprocket, which means basically you have no low end torque. So even the best make small mistakes. So now you have a field that's separated by maybe half what you'd normally expect to be from a lap time perspective. And you have mistakes that punish people twice as much. So you end up with just fantastic racing. From a gearbox category standpoint, two things that were interesting to us is one, the draft, which you normally don't experience a lot of outside of Newcastle. But the other thing that was significant was the ideology between the gearing selection. So you noted there second versus first. And there's kind of a misnomer. People say, oh, this engine is good at the top end. This engine is good in the bottom end. That's not high speed and low speed. That's engine speed. So, an engine can be good in the top end and actually be good on the racetrack and slow corners if you're using first gear. Because your engine pulls at higher RPM, you just shove it into first and don't worry about it. So you saw parity among the engine packages as well. I think probably the best I've ever seen between IAME team and Vortex at different phases in the week. The drivers change their setups. And I went everywhere from absolutely running first gear, and I'm not exaggerating, in every single corner, like first gear in every single corner, to running second gear in some corners and even trying to use second gear in every corner. So you could really vary how your kart worked by chasing either using first or second gear. And then you saw that in the racing. Because, for example, in the first heat, when it was an absolute melee, one of the ways I was able to win that thing was parking it. Honestly, I knew I was going to use first anyway, so I didn't try to roll mid-corner speed. I just made sure my exits were extremely strong. Whereas the weekend went on and everyone kind of figured things out, I worked towards a more rolling high mid-corner rolling speed and focusing on second gear. So I think that was, a big difference you don't see in gearbox racing that you do see in the direct drive stuff is the gear selection playing a big hand in competition. I think that's why you saw, Danny come forward in the final, nothing against, obviously he's one of the best in the world driving wise, but I think he just found that right setup that allowed his engine plus his chassis to work properly.
So were you on that track walk on Tuesday or when the track first came out? Because Danny was in the negative group. I have the messages here from him texting me, and I feel happy to say it now because he won, and he's in good spirits, and he's obviously doing good things, and he ended up very happy with the weekend. But my goodness, the moment that he saw that PDF from SKUSA, he was, I feel like, internally in tears. And I don't blame him because you yourself can understand it. You guys are both very tall guys. You punch a big hole in the air when you go to big racetracks, especially for him and for him on the Vortex this year. That's only been a motor that hasn't been good on the bigger circuits. They haven't figured it out. He stuck the motor twice on Wednesday. But I was telling our guys, Kaleb and Emory, I was like, it would be the best TV ever. Forget the racing on Sunday. If I put Danny from 2 weeks ago on the mic against Danny Sunday night of who had, thoughts on the racetrack. So I'm curious, as a guy that ran good, obviously, like you mentioned, it still did provide a lot of difficulty and options, which was, I think, the coolest thing to the drivers, the teams, the engine builders, the chassis manufacturers of how you want to attack it. What were your first thoughts on the layout before you drove on it or even after you walked it? And then, how do you kind of rate the SuperNats coming out?
Yeah, I mean, I won't forget walking it. I actually got off a plane. I tend to fly in kind of late and leave kind of early because of my work schedule. So I got in pretty late on Tuesday. And I remember walking, coming around the last turn, coming on the straightaway, and I'm looking down, and I thought I knew where the end of the straightaway was because it has those three kinks in it. I will say one advantage to that parking lot is the lighting was fantastic. As I get older, my eyes, I have trouble at night. So I can appreciate that. I can see better than any other SuperNats ever. So thanks for the light post. I'm normally slower at night, which is kind of weird, or shouldn't be slower, but I tend to make more mistakes at night. But anyway, I remember looking down that straightaway and there's those 3 kinks. I was like, oh, that's a long straightaway. And then I got to where I thought the straightaway ended. And that wasn't even turn 1 yet. There was still another straightaway after that. And then you made the final turn, quote unquote, into turn 2. And so I was like, what? This is like a road race. Like we were joking. We were thinking 99, 100 miles an hour, which we weren't far off of. And I'm going back and thinking about gearing. And then I'm looking at, turn 2. And then the second chicane, I'm like, man, this is going to be mostly first gear. And I know, and Danny and I talked because we talked about earlier. I knew he was concerned about the Vortex, 6 gear. We're both big guys. He's broader than me. I'm a little bit taller than he is, but we're both concerned about it. So for both of us to have come away with a decent weekend, I'm pretty happy with. But it's all about never giving up. And I would say, I know I feel that way. And Danny, anybody knows Danny, man, that guy is relentless. There's not a detail he will not go after to pick up that 0.001. And you add enough 0.001s together, and all of a sudden you're going from running in the middle of the top 10 to winning the SuperNats for the 4th time. So, yeah.
Fair enough. Emory, I'll pass it off to you here, and Kaleb first off for any questions as well before I circle back here while we got this superstar with us.
Yeah, I mean, Jordon, at the end of the day, you had another phenomenal weekend, so congrats on that. I really wanted to talk about the raceability. I mean, you mentioned the differences that they had in shifter when it came to kind of selecting gears. And I know from what I was talking to people about, like, start of the weekend was sort of pessimistic, like, oh, every corner is going to be a first gear type of deal. And as we saw, like, the racing, I thought there was a good mix. Like, I can remember a couple of the heats, the guys that were running P2, P3 in the pro classes were oftentimes having it block, and they were doing that by doing kind of what you mentioned in the first heat and parking the bus. And so I guess when you evaluate the track and having just as much slow speed stuff as you did with the one really long straightaway in advance, I mean, how much of a mental load was it to kind of keep track of what you're doing from a racecraft standpoint? Because, I mean, I looked at those racing and I was like, for as simple of a track as people were making it out to be, the racecraft decisions, particularly in the shifter stuff, was really fascinating to watch, because it seemed like it was not easy so much to defend as much as it was, but that, like, having track position was important as it obviously is in shifter, but really it felt like there was a lot of different driving styles that were available to use. So how much of a mental load was that over the course of the weekend to kind of keep track of?
So that's a great question. The reason why is it's probably one of the most mentally challenging race weekends I've had in a go-kart. Typically in karting, the track doesn't change abruptly. You have this ongoing rubber that gets laid down. You make adjustments to your driving line accordingly. This was very different. The difference between the morning and the afternoon and back in the evening, or new tires and old tires, could literally change the gear you're in. In the evenings or the mornings, you might be using second. As the day progresses, you're having to use first. Perhaps the tires, as they're new, you're using second, and then you go used. Now you're starting to use first. So the way you drove the go-kart completely changed. An example would be, in many cases, especially if the track got better, sure, we're using first gear, but you're almost entering the corner, putting it first in on the throttle just so the car doesn't overslow. So you're having to adapt your technique lap to lap. One lap I go in second gear, say into a hairpin, and I'm off the throttle and rolling into the corner or trail braking like I normally would, and then I apply throttle at the apex. That would be like traditional line. But with the next lap, I have to go into first because the tires are wearing more, I'm behind somebody, whatever it may be. Now I'm actually entering on throttle, not that I'm accelerating, but I'm trying to minimize the deceleration because I'm almost in between first and second. So I really want to be in second, but I can't quite be. So I'm on the throttle at turn in, just lightly trying to let the car roll and then getting the throttle in the middle. And I'm making those adjustments multiple times a lap, multiple times throughout that one race, and then multiple times throughout the day. The best example, like the warm up on Sunday morning, I ran new tires to get ready for the final. And I was actually flat all the way through turn 1 and braking when I could see turn 2. That is the first time I've done that. And it kind of scared the shit out of me, to be honest. I'm like full throttle into this thing. And I'd never done it before. But I was braking probably 3 carts to 4 cart lengths deeper just because of the colder temperatures plus new tires. And I absolutely was using second gear almost everywhere. And so that was a huge difference. Of course, knowing my final wasn't until 145, that wasn't going to be possible. And that was absolutely true. One of the things I struggled with, quite frankly, is in the final, I had very little time in the lead. In practice, what I mean by that is in practice, there's a much broader range of talent at Masters. There's a third, and a third. And
Right.
I was passing 20 plus, maybe 30 people a practice session. So I was never able to visualize going into one. And trust me, at 100 miles an hour, you never get comfortable. So every lap is you get more and more comfortable. You never get actually comfortable. And so in the final, I'm like, oh man, I have no one around me. I look back, I'm not blocking. I have nothing to do but drive. That was the first time I experienced nothing in front of me, nothing behind me, and I could actually just drive. And I made a lot of mistakes, nothing visual on video, but I was definitely under driving into one and going into two because I had no idea what my brake markers were supposed to be. Because I was either using someone fast because I was following them in a heat race, I was using someone slow, but I was still using them as a reference point of where they're at on the racetrack. So combined grip changes, gear changes, visual differences. Because at 100 miles an hour, a small time, 0.01 versus 50 miles an hour is twice as much distance. So a very small timing error can cause a catastrophic crash. It's not just a mistake, but at 100 miles an hour, you're going to hit that barrier. And we saw in qualifying, it's not pretty. So I would say one of the most dynamic events I've ever been a part of. And I think that's why you saw racing across all classes to be so good.
Yeah, and I wanted to talk about the dynamic nature of that as well, too, because you mentioned qualifying, and I really thought this weekend with the 4-minute sessions, with how much the track was changing session over session, and even for you guys as well. I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the temperatures final practice to the temperatures when you got into the qualifying was quite a bit different. You ran from a 12-minute session to a 4-minute session, and even though in shifter a lot of the times you guys don't necessarily use all of the session to put in a fast lap, with the 4-minute session and cooler temperatures, it made sense to use all of that. So I was wondering, how much of a challenge did qualifying day throw you? Because I know, in speaking to some other people over the course of the weekend, it was one thing in single speed where it was it's kind of you build up to it. Even though the track conditions are different and the timing is different, you still drove, I would guess, relatively similar. But at night with cooler temperatures, having to get heat in those tires quicker. I mean, how much of a challenge was that? And then lap over lap, where do you find how do you find the confidence to be able to push so hard in the brake like that? Because I know that, like you mentioned, the turn one braking zone was deeper than pretty much any other braking zone that you're going to find really in the national calendar. And not only that, but you have at the time a layout that seemed extremely sketchy because they had just changed it. So how did that factor in, and how are you able to adapt to the 4-minute structure there?
Yeah, so honestly, I'm more nervous entering qualifying than a main event. I feel like a main event, I have control. Obviously, there's the nerves of the start, because if you bog, you have to lose a few spots, etc., and you never know what your competitors are going to do. The qualifying, you're going out, you just don't know how the traffic is going to end up catching you. And we knew that because of the cooler temperatures and, quite frankly, the way the track was rubbering in, that the last lap was going to be the only lap that mattered. And for me, I was 7th, by the way, on the second to last lap. And I actually made a pretty big mistake on the final lap where I probably would have been on pole. Now, it would have made no difference, ironically, because I started on pole in the final. But, what I did is I went out and I ran my first 2 laps. I went out in the front of the field. That was what I prefer to do. I purposely tried to not go too fast to catch the back of the field. And I actually, out of the 4 laps we had, we estimated we'd have 4 and then possibly a 5th. So I spent 2 laps warming the tires. Again, it's probably not clear on video, but I was using the whole straightaway left to right, because straightaway cools down the tires, especially on a long straightaway like that. If you don't go and use the full straightaway barrier to barrier, your tires will be colder than when you started the straightaway. So I went barrier to barrier all the way down straight, zigzagging, and it's sketchy, it's sliding a whole bunch. I did the same thing for the first 2 laps. And then I realized, okay, I have 2 laps, maybe 3 to actually put down a heater. And no matter what, the next lap's going to be better. Unless I make just a crazy error, every single lap matters, period, full stop. That is very nerve-wracking for a driver, especially going into unknown conditions. The track was cold, new tires, which are very slippery when it's cold. And so And I had to pass people on my third and fourth lap. Had I not had that fifth lap, I would have been probably seventh. I mean, like that's where I was when I crossed the line on lap 4. My lap 5 was clear of traffic. I made one small error. For those that don't race gearboxes, going from 1 to 2 is actually a fairly difficult shift. It's a high RPM drop, so you have to rev higher than normal, and the crispness of that shift can impact your lap time pretty significantly. So you tend to shift, let's call it more aggressively. In other words, you try to let off the throttle, not all the way, and use just arm strength to yank it to gear, especially during a qualifying lap. And I quite frankly just got that wrong. I pull on the shifter and it didn't shift. And I'm sitting there banging off, the reeds in first gear. And then I grabbed second. And of course, it was on the main straight. So I lost the most gap. I lost right at 2.5 tenths, which would put me like within hundredths of being on pole. So we never know. But yeah, so I think for me, the nervousness and the approach, it's actually it's more difficult than almost the race.
Yeah, and one last thing before I'm going to give Kaleb some time to ask some questions here. But I just want to know, I mean, Davide was able to run both classes this weekend, and he kind of had, in that sense, double the seat time. And with the exception of the main event, I mean, the main event, you have completely different track conditions from warm-up to the main in both classes. So in his case, he was going into both mains blind. But over the course of the weekend, do you feel like that had any effect? Because, I mean, it's certainly – he wasn't necessarily up at the very front of the main shifter category, but he certainly would have had more track time. So is that something that you feel like maybe played a part or even maybe helped you with some physical wear? Or what were some of your thoughts on that?
So physically, the track was not difficult. Long straightaway, low grip, especially here. I just got back from Europe. I got to race in Germany at the World Championships and 4A races there all the time, man. Nothing in the U.S. compares. Short version, when I went over to practice, by the way, in Germany, and I'm pretty fit, I made it 4 out of 7 practice sessions and I quit. Now, luckily, the practice weekend is a month before the race weekend. So I spent an entire month on the iron neck thing, trying to get my neck stood because I literally flew all the way to Germany for a 7-session practice, only made 4 of them. That's how brutal it is over there. So to race over here was physically not an issue. So that I don't think is an issue. However, normally I would say any pro level driver should be able to learn the track in the sessions that we have. I would say typically there's no advantage to running 2 classes or very little. The only time it becomes an advantage if you have an issue like an engine failure and you lose a practice or mechanical or something. Now you only have 3 practices. So that extra practice can make a huge difference. But I think in this case, at least for me, I think there was an advantage. And if you look at his pace in the Masters category, he did get faster relatively. I mean, the first heat, he started 7th because of the penalty. He got to 3rd. But never really was exceptionally quick. I mean, clearly, I'm not in dreamland. He was the fastest driver this weekend. The fastest driver won. It's disappointing to me, but it's reality. Facts are facts. But his pace was not what it was. As it was on Sunday. All of a sudden, he found something, and whether he would have found just running Masters, I don't know. For me, the reason why I emphasize that and say normally it's not an issue is because of how little free laps I got in practice. I was literally passing somebody every single lap. So I never had a rhythm. Turn 1, again, was definitely a challenge. It was scary to say the least. Literally you're going into going, okay, am I going to survive this lap? And so you never really build up I never found a reference. I was using like a peripheral reference. Normally I try to find a line on the track, like going into the last turn, there was a bump. I knew exactly where to brake. At the beginning of the race, I'd brake at the bump. About 3 laps in, I'd brake 1 car length past the bump. And then by the end of the race, I was braking somewhere around 2 to 3 car lengths past the bump. But going into turn 1 at 100 miles an hour, I had no references because I was always around somebody. So I think normally I would say, no, there's not a huge advantage. And I still don't think it was a huge advantage. But had he not had the extra practice, would he have been able to make up the gap that I was able to put on the field? I don't know. His pace earlier in the weekend would have said no. And that's why I had that bit of a gap. I definitely didn't cruise. People asked me, did you slow down? Did you go to cruise control because you had such a huge lead? I knew 4A was coming. He's best in the world for a reason. I pushed every lap. So I wouldn't have done anything different. But would he have had 2.5 tenths or 2 tenths on me every lap like he did once he got free? I don't know. He didn't have that early in the weekend. So, at the end of the day, he won and he followed the rules. He didn't cheat. He won because he was faster, and that's good. And I'm happy for him. But I do think in this case, for me, I don't know if I'd say it's an advantage for him, but it was a disadvantage for me not to have that extra time free track.
Interesting.
My first question.
Go ahead.
I guess Xander. Sorry. Yeah.
No,
Well,
good
my
in
first
there.
question here for you, Mr. Musser. I mean, it seemed like all weekend it was just like a struggle with the track getting rubbered in, right? So like my first question would be, how long did it take you to find the setup, and did you even find, I guess, the perfect setup going into the final? Because I mean, looking at a driver like AJ Myers, for him in the final, he struggled with that setup, and he was just sliding around for the opening laps of that race, right? So I just want to know how long it took you to find a setup, even if you did find the setup, because like you said, you were sliding around kind of as the weekend progressed.
Yeah, so the Burrell has a pretty wide tuning window. That's one thing that's nice about it. I've had some mechanics that actually get frustrated me because I don't want to change enough. Franz, the team manager for PSL, he gets on my case because I don't change enough stuff. He's always trying to get me to change things. So I don't think setup-wise it was that difficult for me. I stayed within the range, the window that I know the Burrell works on. We were running fairly soft in the rear to make sure that it would flex coming off the corners and grip. And then we ran a fairly stiff front end to make sure the front was positive. In other words, I wanted the chassis to go where I pointed it. So if I'm turning the wheel, I want to go where the steering tells it to. Some people would call that a loose go-kart, but I feel it's one that goes where I tell it to. And if it's loose, it's able to go too much. And then we ran a soft rear so that once I had the car set in the middle of the corner, I could get to maximum throttle as quick as possible, especially in first gear. Having maximum forward grip, if you're going to use first gear, is imperative. And if in turn one in traffic, you're using the clutch. So if you can dump the clutch and the cart grips, and you can make a pass, and that's how a lot of passes are done in turn three, at least for me, was that if the guy kind of slows down on purpose in front of me to try to bottle me up, I'm already on the clutch on the brakes. I know he's going to do it. So anytime I was in second or third, I was on the clutch under braking going into two, and I was prepared. I had the throttle pinned and I dumped the clutch on the exit. And because I had good forward bite, comparatively, I'd usually have a run because he tried to overslow and mess with me going into three. So for me, I don't think the setup was that big of a deal. The bigger difference was just a light touch. When the track is slippery, and we even saw it in the pro category, I think AJ slid past turn two. You don't see mistakes like that from him very often. The range of online versus a full cart length offline was very narrow. You're talking tenths of miles an hour. Where on a grippier track, a mistake of a half mile an hour on entry because you're over driving might only move you over a half car width. So that's the difference between driving on a non-rubbered in track and a rubbered in track, is that your mistakes look more obvious, especially to the spectator. And also a larger mistake, especially like going into one, like we saw from qualifying and pro, can put you in the wall. If the track was rubbered from left to right, Abbasi would have never hit the wall. He would have just lifted and stuck on the outside and been slower. But instead, he was in the gray, aka outside of any rubber, and there was no catching the car. So one of my focus areas, especially when I was leading, was to do not overdrive. Because if I underdrive, let's say it's going to cost me 0.02 a lap, 0.03, less than a half a tenth. But if I overdrive even one corner, that could be 0.2, because now I'm offline. Not only have I lost momentum and rolling speed, but now I can't accelerate because I'm going to spin the tires. So that was the big difference between a non-rubbered and a rubbered track, is a much more delicate touch. And although underdriving is relative, I was obviously driving very hard. And when I say underdriving, I'm talking less than a half tenth. But that I gave up that less than a half a tenth to ensure I didn't have any 0.2 mistakes.
And that part makes sense too, right? I mean, part of that, I'm sure, is the same way a lot of guys describe barrier racing. When you go back to some of the SuperNats iterations before, when we wouldn't pay for the concrete curbing on the inside of the corner, you'd give up, a couple hundredths to run maybe, a foot or so, or a half foot, or a couple more inches off the barrier so you don't rip a tie rod. That makes sense. I want to finish off this a little bit here because I know, again, you probably got work tomorrow. But I think there's no question. And the viewers and comments and the messages I've been getting even during the show are super impressed with the breakdown that you have. I think this has been super cool to have, Jordon. But my question for you is, what draws you back, right? Obviously, everyone can hear from the passion in your voice and the detailed explanation in your breakdowns how into this sport you are and how knowledgeable you are and how good, obviously, you are if they watched at all of the race weekend. But for a guy like yourself, I mean, like you said, you outlined it so well coming out of last weekend into this week that you're like, yep, I come out of the race weekend, I go straight 4 hours away from where I live to go to work. And then, it's either to the next race or it's maybe back home on the weekend. So can you describe what keeps that fire going for yourself?
Man, I love racing. I love motorsports in general. I love being a part of it. I'm obviously not a big spectator, which is kind of funny. Like I saw my first F1 race in Austin this year, and I didn't even stay for the race. I actually just watched qualifying. I had to get out of there. But the close competition and the parity, there's no excuses to not winning a go-kart race other than you were not as good as you should have been. And you could be driver or input to the mechanic. It doesn't mean that literally the driver was worse, because we know that we've seen AJ beat Formal and Kremers beat both of them. And we see those top 5 guys in pro going back and forth. So it's not pure driving. It's you as a human being, man and machine, having the best combination. And the reason it's so competitive is, although it's quite expensive, there's no one that ran the SuperNats can say it was cheap. But comparatively speaking, we're racing Formula One in karting. You have no expense spared across anything. You have the best engines, the best tires, the best go-karts, the best mechanics. And an arrive and drive program for the SuperNats is under $10,000. I don't know what a one-off ride would cost on a Formula One car, but I can assure it's more than that. And an IMSA race is $100K. So you're talking about a relatively low barrier of threshold. I practice. I don't race as much as most other people. I wish I did, but I practice often, and it costs me basically just tires and fuel. So let's call it $100, $200 tops a day to go do some practice. I load the go-kart in the back of my trailer. I drive my local track. I unload it by myself, throw some gas in, and I go drive. And so the fact that the sport is so approachable that anybody in the middle class-ish, if they're dedicated enough, now it's painful to write the checks. I completely understand. I come from a very modest background, but you can race LO206. You can race 100cc if you really want to. And that means you have a broad base of talented, passionate people that want to go racing, which means that even the more expensive like shifter, those people are trickling. They go race 100cc for a year and they're like, oh, I have a shifter budget. I want to go do that. And then they move up. So that's what keeps me fired up, is the people that kick my ass. If I won all the time, it wouldn't be that much fun. 4A and quite frankly, the entire top 15 of the shifter class is very competitive. They keep me fired up. I worked my butt off the last 2 years to continue to evolve my craft. And so competition is really, at the end of the day, close, fair competition. I got into a bit of not an argument, but a discussion with Ron White, some other guys on Facebook about engines. And there were some incorrect statements that Kremers was running a suitcase engine from Italy. And I was like, man, actually, PSL built that motor. I ran the exact same engine on practice. I switched to a SweeTech for the race, but they were almost identical in performance. And then you look at IAME, TM, and Vortex all running the top 3 in the final and passing each other in straightaway, passing each other infield. The parity in karting is second to none. And so competition plus parity, it makes it the best motorsport in the world, no question.
Well, we are very lucky to have both a guy of your talent and such a great ambassador as a part of our sport, Jordon. So before we get to our next commercial break, come to a lot of the viewer questions that have started to come in. There is one for you, and this was from Mike Smith from the booth, now as a viewer again. He was asking you as a question, how did braking change with tire wear and as the race wore on, which obviously ran a full 20 laps in the main. So did the braking distance change? You said it was a moving target in turn 1. Was it a moving target anywhere else?
Yeah, so the difference between lap 1 and lap 3 was probably 20 to 30 feet going into 1, and similar going to the last hairpin. So that was the 2 high-speed brake zones. And then you kind of settle in, and then you start incrementing by inches after that. So 30 feet is not uncommon for lap 1 through lap 3. And then it's like inches at that point, to where you probably pick up another kart length between lap 4 and lap 10. The bigger difference in lap times, if you notice the incremental improvements, is really rolling speed. You're constantly making adjustments to where you're going to find your mid-corner speed to get on the power earliest. Because most of the lap time is mid-corner and exit. Entry is extremely important. It's the difference between the very best and maybe just below the very best, but your actual lap times are middle and off. So braking distance change. The bigger difference was morning to middle of the day. Literally the morning of the final, which is the first time I'd run on a cool racetrack on sticker tires, I was full throttle all the way through turn 1, could see turn 2, and then I was on the brakes, versus braking in the middle of turn 1.
Very interesting. Well, Jordon, thanks again. We'll let you get some sleep, buddy. But we really appreciate you coming on the show. I'm sure I'm going to be asking you to come on a lot more stuff, a lot more often as we.
I think we just lost Xander.
Uh-oh. And now I'm hosting. Surprise. Thank you guys for having me. It's been he's back. There we go.
I've done this. All right, I got a new mouse. You know, it wouldn't be a happy hour if I didn't screw up some way. So yeah, it's fun. Most people don't know is I have like 100% undiagnosed attention disorder, and I just like to push buttons, and I pushed the wrong button. So anyway, Jordon, thank you, man. It's been a blast. You have added a ton of insight here, so we appreciate the time, man.
Anytime. Thank you guys very much. Nice hanging out with you guys.
Yeah, nice.
Thank you, Jordon.
All right. With that, everyone, it's time to go to happy hour. It's time for me to figure out what I got going on. But we'll continue to roll on. Commercial break coming up. Q&A after, and these guys have some more questions for me as well when we get into the X30 stuff, some of the KA stuff. Obviously, that was a big breakdown and an awesome breakdown and everything with shifter racing and a lot with the racetrack as well. But we've got some more thoughts, so the show's not over. We'll see you guys right after the break.
Are you a racing enthusiast? Drive Your Line is the Mid-South's only full-service kart shop. We make dreams a reality for those 5 years old and up. All racers start in karting, and we're the purveyors of fun for the whole family. Karting the Coast is presented by Drive Your Line Kart Shop and is the premier race series on the Gulf Coast and brings racing to Biloxi at Finish Line Performance Karting and at the world-renowned NOLA Motorsports Park. Call us at 601-667-0770 or find us at driveyourline.com. Also on Facebook or Instagram.
Kart Store USA is a kart parts supplier that racers and retailers can count on when they need reliable advice and service. We focus on servicing all racers with honesty and pride while maintaining customer satisfaction. We carry a full stock of Kart Republic and Tony Kart chassis, as well as IAMI and Vortex Rock engines. We've also got a host of other parts available and in stock, such as products from Rev Performance Materials, Jecco Racing Seats, and more. We have a 100% satisfaction guarantee. And on top of that, if your order exceeds $200, shipping is on us. Check out all we have to offer today by visiting us online at kartstore-usa.com. All right. I think my mic's unmuted, fellas, here. Hopefully I didn't screw it up too bad, eh? Am I back all right?
Yeah, you're good. You're good.
All right. Good deal. Wanted to check there. Whoops. All right, so let's get into the rest of the racing over the weekend. I wanted to kick things off. First of all, I was actually talking with Harley Keeble a little bit about this. I was relatively impressed with two aspects of our American full timers. I was pretty proud of obviously how good everybody ran in all the classes. And American full timers, counting guys like Danny from Costa Rica because he runs with us all year. Our buddies from Mexico, Ernesto Rivera, Fernando Luque was looking good. Obviously, Donovan Bonilla, what a weekend for him. Super good. And counting guys like Kremers and Hodgson and these other international superstars that have moved to America or at least started racing full time in America. I thought that was cool that it was pretty much up front in every class, a regular season American race, with the exception of only a couple. Obviously KA Masters had some new guys join the front, but the juniors was the same. The mini was the same. The micro the same. The senior and the shifter up front was the same. The best that, anyone that was a one-off SuperNats guy could do was Mateo Vagano in third, and that guy's been coming here for 10 years. And in talking with Keeble and a few of the other guys, it was, we've been fighting for legitimacy in our country to be respected by the European full-timers for, I feel like, a long time. In the same way with having a guy like Jordon, going head-to-head with 4A and whooping his butt, all weekend up until that final where Davide was a little better. He's one of the best of all time. To have that competition here where those guys come over and struggle was cool. And it feels like, more than almost ever that all of the drivers are kind of ambassadors collectively for the country and for the racing that we have over here. I was really proud of that. And I was also proud of kind of how they handled some of the stuff on the racetrack, because both races I thought were respectful in the right ways. And when a guy was doing the wrong thing, he got taken care of pretty quickly.
Yeah, definitely. And I think as a whole, the racecraft was phenomenal. When you look at how sketchy the track looked initially, according to some people, and the amount of straight up crashing zone, so to speak, to end up with no red flags over the course of the whole race weekend, or at least over the course of all the racing, to have really battles at the front that were, for the most part, extremely clean. I mean, you had a couple of questionable things there with Ellie Goldstein in the first heat. And then on the shifter side of things, obviously, Million Dinner getting crashed out on turn 1, lap 1, and a little bit of contact there with Gulick and Myers. But pretty much, I mean, race after race, there wasn't a whole lot of crashing and contact that took place during the weekend. And I think that speaks to the racecraft level of our guys, and also just in general, the event, at least for SuperNats standards, felt like it was extremely clean. And then you look at the pace side of things, and I mean, you can say, well, yeah, technically speaking, Donovan Bonilla and Danny Formal aren't American, but these are guys we've seen on our circuit the entire year, the entire last few years. I mean, Danny Formal, a 4-time SuperNats champion, Donovan Bonilla winning for both the first and the last race of the year, like, and then all up at the front. I mean, the only international guys that I would say were really in the top 10 for the entire weekend. On the shifter side of things, you have Matteo Viano and Million Dinner. Those guys were up at the front. And then on the pro side of things, you had Ellie Goldstein running at the front of the field as well. But for the most part, like, this was, like you mentioned, Xander, more or less a regular season race. And I really think it was a change a bit from last year. I mean, last year you had Pedro Lopren running up at the front, and obviously Pedro ran a little bit on the U.S. scene in 2022. Marcus Kayak was up at the front last year. And in general, I believe it was 6 of the top 10 guys in SuperNats 25 starting in the top 10 in shifter were international and were guys that really had not run much of the pro scene at all. So year over year to have that flip and suddenly you're having heavy U.S. influence. I mean, it's vindicative for us to be able to say, like, hey, like, this is the product we're seeing every weekend. Only now it's on a bigger scale. More people are watching internationally. More people are getting to see this. And it really does a good job of showcasing just what the U.S. show is. And it's a good representation of the drivers as well. I mean, someone like Jacob Gulick, who can now say that he sat on pole and run at the front the entire weekend against probably the most stacked front half of the field in shifter that at least I've personally seen in the last 7-8 years of SuperNats. Or Kyle Wick, for example, having an incredible pace. Like, those are guys that are certainly not necessarily household names internationally, like a Kremers, like a Denner, like a Ippolito, like an Albanese. Like, those guys, to have that sort of showcase for their talent, I think is a really good thing for our sport, and more specifically our sport in this country.
Yeah. And I think I can go off a little bit to what Emory said, right? I think one of the guys, okay, I guess I'll give a quick shout out here to Talon Yako, right? It's a second year in shifter, and he was fighting with those big name European drivers at the front of the field. And he's a guy that was under AJ Myers' wing last year and even this year, but he's really coming into his own. And then I think this race at SuperNats showed it a lot as well, right? Because he was up there fighting with guys. I mean, obviously the final didn't go his way after he crashed with Denner, but I think all weekend long he was fighting up there, and his name was in the conversation in between cracking the top 5 and then in that top 10 as well, right? But I think the level here in the U.S. is definitely with guys like Marian, Danny, AJ, Wick, Gulick, you know, all these guys with Yako and others, you know, that are starting to crack their name into the conversation, the big national stuff, like Talon Yako, is just showing how far karting in the U.S. has gone and how competitive it is here to have the European champion and the world champion further back in the field. You know, barely cracking into the top 10 at the weekend shows a lot of how far American karting's gone.
And it's not all positive. I got a few Hall of Shame nominees from this weekend. First, starting off really disappointed in Niels Troger. It was really cool to see SRP bring over Tim Troger earlier this year, who was obviously super fast. David Trefilov joining him at the SuperNats, super fast. Trefilov was super fast, drove up a ton of spots. And then Niels and his mechanic on Wednesday in final practice knew they were pushing tight on weight and decided to see that, you know, or maybe just didn't respect the American SKUSA officials and try to throw a 6-pound, lead block into Niels's helmet so he could make a minimum weight and still be in the fast group for Thursday, practice, which as things shaken out, he probably would have been better off in the slow group getting a full session in. Got DQ'd from the whole weekend, and you're talking the KZ2 world champion. I was so disappointed to finally get that story because I didn't understand why he got thrown out for underweight because that's not a full weekend DQ. But for a world FIA champion to be trying to throw a lead block into his helmet to make him wait on the first of 2 practice days is pretty bad. So that guy goes right up there as probably number 1 in the Hall of Shame on this week, if not one of the few. Secondly, I felt like with I won't dog on him too hard. I was a bit disappointed with Ellie Goldstein this week, and I talked to him a little bit. I know he didn't agree with the penalty that he got, but I was kind of rooting and a bit more proud of some of the guys that were roughing him up because he did not come in respecting these American guys in the way they want to drive. I had a long talk with him as long as I could on Thursday or Friday night after the heat races, and was like, hey, we've had a lot of problems with Euro swerving in our country. I mean, there was a clip of TJ Coyne getting thrown into the wall. It wasn't even intentional in a practice session, but guys aren't having spatial awareness. And if they are having spatial awareness and they're doing it intentionally, it's a problem. So these guys are on high alert to put any penalties down for looking over to your left or your right and seeing someone there and then turning your steering wheel towards them. And you don't want to listen to it. And then, and that's a problem. And to all the viewers and the drivers watching along, and Ellie's may not like this, and he may not be too happy with me for saying this, but, what I tried to lay out to him and what I've always laid out as a driver is that I don't need to agree with everything the race director says or wants to call, but I need to know what are the extensions of my sandbox, and if he's going to call that, then I'm not going to do that. And if he's going to let me do something, then I'm going to do that thing if I think it's going to benefit me. And I'm breaking any of that down. Ellie didn't want to hear it. He's like, I've been racing karts for 10 years. I know what karting is. I know how to race. And I'm, and again, I don't think he made any attempts to rectify his relationships with any of the drivers here in the U.S. And sure enough, they kind of spit him up, shoot him out. And poor guy didn't end up on the top 10 of the main. Didn't even end up in the top 20. Ended up getting put in the wall. So, but we've been saying that for a long time, that not necessarily to wreck guys, but that there is an elder statesman class now in X30 Pro. There's been one for a long time in Shifter. It is really cool to watch in Shifter how Formal and Myers, no matter their disagreements, or them and Kremers, or any of the other guys, the level of respect they have and how they have a set code of conduct, no matter who the race director is, of how they're going to race each other. And the X30 guys are getting there. KA guys have a lot harder battle to fight because of there's so much younger drivers coming through that the turnover's so quick. It's hard to get a kind of driver council developed on the same page and all firing on all cylinders. But I was proud of our guys on that front. I don't want to knock Brandon Carr and Keeble even too hard for some instances they ended up getting into, but in a similar degree, they kind of bloodied their own nose a little bit. But they're both young kids, 15, 16 years old. Goldstein's a bit older, so he should know better on that front. And then the rest of the weekend, man, tip of the hat to Danny. I'd love to send out the text, but tip of the hat to Dono. God, man, that kid, Bonilla, he is just such a go-lucky, fun kid. I mean, you just can't do anything but root for him. Like, he is just so goofy and so funny. To have him win that race was just awesome, dude. It was so fun to see Donovan win.
Yeah, no, I think we have the Donovan Bonilla Council outside of Xander out here. Shout out to Kaleb.
Yeah, big Mexico pride. That was cool. That was cool to see him win. And yeah, dude, this is a great point from Samuel Doherty. How about it for Danny, a fish, with his deal coming together, getting to be on the Daytona, go run the Daytona 24 with the Andretti Wayne Taylor Racing sports car deal to get right over the weekend. I mean, you talk about a crazy 2 weeks for this guy. Imagine if he wins the Lamborghini Super Trofeo Worlds this week. Like, what a 14 days it could be for the big fella.
And then I think you saying that, right, shows a lot how karting, I guess, translates into cars. Danny being one of the best karting guys here in the U.S. and then doing what he's doing in Super Trofeo and then having that chance to go to Lamborghini Worlds is something else.
We had a question from Luda Thigpen. This was how many American-born drivers took home first place from this weekend. So we had Maxwell Macha, born in Tampa, Florida, won micro. Minnie Swift, Royce Vega, American. Both junior classes. Turner Brown, California kid. So that's 4. Obviously, 4A puts it 4-1 with Master Shifter. 4 Miles, Costa Rican. That's 4-2. And then Mexico. With Bonilla and Rivera, 4-4. I feel like I'm missing a class. Oh, and then KA Masters, Australian or Kiwi. Do you guys remember? Was he? Oh, dude, I feel so bad.
And he's more the analyst.
I think it was Australian, but
yeah. Either way, guy from down under, 4-5. So 4 American wins, technically by North America. 6 American wins on the weekend at the SuperNats. So there's a split there.
But outside of Masters, 7 for 7 in terms of drivers who've driven on the American circuit this year. You think about it, like Bonilla and Rivera. I mean, even though they come from Mexico, even though they came from Mexico, they've run pretty much a full U.S. calendar. No, Bonilla is actually his second race in the U.S. dating back to early part of summer. And it was one of the things I was talking to him on the grid about on Thursday. Was like, hey, like it's kind of you get thrown back into the fray of things. Like he had been racing pretty much full time in the U.S. from the early part of 2022 until through Winter Series when she had the win. Kind of gets away from it a little bit. He comes back and suddenly he comes back to USPKS GoPro or Trackhouse. It's really that happens every time. But he comes back to Trackhouse and he's immediately struggling, gets a little bit better there. And then I was talking to him on Thursday and he was like, we went from being 35th, 40th, now we're 15th to 25th. And it feels like a mountain to climb, but he's felt optimistic. And just to get back to that level was impressive. But I think as a whole, him, Ernesto, I mean, we've talked about Ernesto's sheer pace that he has for a long time at this point, and being able to run full season in junior and more or less dominate everything he runs, and then come up to senior and instantly be contending for wins is super cool. And I think the biggest headline for me on the weekend, and Xander, I think I'm going to kind of bring this over to you a little bit, is when you look at RPG, I mean, it's been a successful year for them. I don't think that there's any question about that. But in a sense, it's been kind of a little bit more of under the radar. I mean, Norberg failing to win a national race, and then the X30 side of things, they hadn't had a single national win they did not have a single win from Miami until 2 weeks ago, or a month ago in Trackhouse with Hayden. And now suddenly you look up and they have 4 SuperNats winners, 3 of them in kind of the 3 biggest classes of the weekend with 3 different drivers, a 4th one inside the top 6 in the pro category. You have Danny suddenly looking like a force and shifter. For how up and down the season's been, I mean, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, it seems like RPG kind of finally found the rhythm over the last month or so. And now, I mean, you go from maybe a down year for Rollison's standards to suddenly now having the biggest weekend we've seen in a while in SuperNats to sweep all of the pro categories and even the biggest semi-pro category in KA.
Yeah, I would agree, right? It didn't really set in, I think, until after Danny won, how much they won and were up front all week. Ben Cooper would have been the other guy to win KA Masters if it wasn't the way it shook out. So they had, bullets in the gun all the way through, almost won both the junior races when Turner Brown got it done. So, when you talk those guys winning and running really good, I think the year, and this is a great point from Samuel as well. He's like, what I can't recall, when was it, outside of Norberg taking all the wins, who else was winning? I mean, obviously, we can remember at least a little bit that, Nate Cicero won a few races. Hayden Jones won a few races. Karina Meyer would win. Briggs Tyner. I don't remember if Tyner won one, but if he did, it was only a couple.
He almost won Pro Tour in 21, though, no?
He did. He did almost win the championship, but I don't think he won a race that year. I think Greenemeyer won a race in Utah. I think he was top 3 all the way through. I could be wrong, but I think he was close.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, last year felt like more of just a Norberg year because there were more guys kind of coming and going, and then Hayden for a bit and came close to beating Ryan, and then Cicero. Obviously, Hayden was over at Trinity all year, comes back, wins right off the bat at his home racetrack. And, Benio was hit or miss, but you look at the junior stuff, dominant. I mean, up until the summer when the Speed Concepts Racing, Speed Lab guys figured something out, got Turner Brown running good, got Nathan Dupuis good. Then it became kind of a good battle in junior, but junior was RPG only to start the year to the point that there was still like heavy cheating rumors from everyone. And the class numbers probably went down a little bit because they were kicking so much ass in X30 and GP. And then to end the year like that, I think at this point, everyone realizes how good Ernesto is. That kid is starbound. What a superstar. Great kid, super respectful. And not that Donovan isn't great either. I mean, those two were head-to-head all year and have been head-to-head for years in Mexico. So to have the end of the weekend like that probably does bring the year up a good chunk. And it's funny that, in some of the classes, like they were second to PSL in X30 at USPKS leading into the final round. Second to them or third to them, through the Pro Tour, if not worse. And then it flips, and PSL is second to them, in a couple of classes here. Speed second to them in a couple of classes here. Like, I would put either one of those two programs right up there in a head-to-head battle with Raleigh as who was the best team on the year. And you have a SuperNats like that where, it's a little bit of odds to win one class. It's a lot of odds to win 4. That's mega.
And not just that, but with 4 different drivers too. And
Right.
yeah. And I think I look at that, and I mean, you can say all you want to about how Norbert kind of went through the field and how Bonilla was, but at the end of the day, to me, it speaks more to an operation if you're having a number of guys up there, because we've seen, whether it be PSL with Kremers, whether it be RPG with Norberg, turning Chad Dockett, that the guys that are at the front of the field in their classes that are kind of the factory guys for these teams are going to be running at the front. But I mean, Rawlison, arguably, I think some of what kind of made people think about, hey, maybe this has been a bit of a decline for them has been the lack of other guys at the front of the field this year in X30 Pro without Hayden there, with Bonilla again kind of taking a hiatus in the middle of the year. And I mean, it's no hate to guys like Laurent Legault, but it's he was more so in that 12th to 16th range, whereas the years prior you saw 3, 4, 5 RPG Cosmics in the top 10. And I think that to have a SuperNats where you basically have so many different representations among the brand in the top 10 is impressive. And I think as well as that, like we see, and I think Samuel Lee with a good comment about the variety of chassis in the US, I think we're finally seeing to where I was 2-3 years ago, there was a big debate about everyone running OTKs, and OTK is the go-to chassis. I think for a while before PSL got a heavier presence and before we started seeing more Braille Arts, you really saw the top 10 with some split of KR versus OTK. Now you're seeing more of a flip between the 3. And I think Xander here can provide some more context to what I was going to say on this. But I think, honestly, it's a good point in that now we're finally seeing factory Sodi guys with Harley Keeble, with Amelia Dinner coming over for SuperNats. And as rough as it was as well, Cinnabon Walshing coming over for SummerNats and being competitive. And then on the flip side, we've talked about Burrell Art. We've seen other SCRGs kind of been in and out of the U.S. market the last couple of years. I think that there's optimism on their side that for 2024 and beyond, whether it be with Tesoro or other guys, that they can kind of find that last little bit. And I mean, you go down the line. So I agree. I think the chassis variety has started to come back around in the U.S. And Xander, I mean, I know you can probably provide more than I can on this, but certainly it looks like it's heading in the right direction in that sense, more towards what we see internationally, where every single team seems to have their big factory guys and their go-to chassis representatives.
Yeah. I think that over here things have been stable. The promoters, obviously, without tooting our own horn, us have a pretty big spotlight in the U.S., bigger than what happened before we showed up. That helps. I know with Sodi and KR, that's part of the reason that there's an effort here. The market's always been big. It's just where in the U.S. would you go and try to bring a lot of go-karts to outside of SuperNats? And even then, SuperNats wasn't the stream for so many years. And then it was, and it was okay. So, to have FI at Worlds level or very close to audience numbers, it's worth it for those guys to bring their best foot forward, which is cool. The truth is, again, a lot of the go-karts are very similar. If they're CIK homologated or built to those specs, even if they're not homologated, they're not that far off. But, everyone's a little different, so it takes a smart guy to know how to dial it in. And, with the engines, I don't know if I have the right answer. I think Jordon gave a lot better insight to why the multi-make stuff ended up looking really, good. But from a chassis point of view, it probably does help that we've gone to, or our tire has changed. The MG and Avinco tire especially now lays down a lot less rubber, because our problem for the longest time for the manufacturers of the go-karts was that they would run higher horsepower engines at lower minimum weights overseas in the classes they would build them for than what we race over here. Up until a few years ago, 206 racing or any kind of four-stroke low horsepower racing was near non-existent in Europe. And don't even, 100cc only came over there like 2 years ago. I'm sure there were other go-karts and stuff like that, but for the most part, they would run, they would build the chassis to the 40 horsepower single speeds, the 50 horsepower shifters, and they would run at 20 to 40 pounds lighter than we do. So then when the go-karts would come over here, they'd be overstuck. Well, now we're on a more of a synthetic rubber with the MG and Avinco tires everywhere. And a lot of the other tires don't lay down as much rubber because they're meant to last longer. So we're not laying down the grip like Jordon's saying. Yeah, there's grip over there, and those guys do get stuck, but they also run at a lighter weight. And so since we run at a heavier weight, we kind of have that extra like stuck into the racetrack kind of grip. And that kind of now I think has been dissipated a bit by the tire. So it's a combination of the fact that the guys over here have stepped up their game. The chassis over here are giving more and more support to the American guys they work with to run up front at our races because they see the value in it. And I think the third thing that helps is now, even though we may be still on those slower engines, we're not as stuck to the racetrack as we used to be. So their standard adjustments they make over there can work over here. But I think that's part of it. So Kaleb, I want to toss it to you here. Emory and I have ate up a lot of screen space, and we're getting to the end of time. So what's last on your mind?
No, I mean, I think I agree, right? There's a whole bunch of different chassis that have, I guess, dabbled in here. I mean, we saw CRG with Frankie Mossman at Utah. He was running up there at the front. We saw them again at PKS with John Burke, who was running in the top 10 that weekend in both KA and X30, to talk a little bit about CRG, and then the Sodi guys as well. Your variety of OTK chassis with Speed Concepts, with RPM, RPG, and all those guys, and then you have the Burrells as well, right? So I think the whole variety part is great, because you see a handful of different chassis in a race weekend, and then every different race weekend it could be somebody else that's up at the front. So I think that's something really good to see. And like you said, with engines and tires, that stuff just adds to the spectacle of it.
Well, as we wrap up the show, guys, we've had a great run. I don't know for certain if we'll do happy hour number 100 next Wednesday before Thanksgiving, or if we'll do it 1 week after in the gap. I'd like to maybe push it back one more week, give us a bit of vacation time, and a little bit of time to plan, because I got some homework to do to make sure that we really kick off 2024 with a bang. There's no question that none of our success, this show's success, this brand success happens without any one of you that are watching, that listen back on after, or anything of that nature, or any of the cool improvements to the sport that we got going on. I had some really great conversations this weekend. I have a lot more I need to get to, but it's exciting. It's cool to be a part of, and you guys are the reason. And this movement is just as much all of us on screen as it is all of you guys watching. So for 99 episodes, thank you guys so much. For Emory, for Kaleb, myself, we've got one more to go here with happy hour, one more Car Chaser bit to finish the year. And we got a lot of cool stuff coming for next year. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.